Friends, this video is not recommended for viewing by persons with unstable mentality, underage and just impressionable people. Some of the materials in this video are simply shocking. Hello, Geo is with you. More recently, I was talking about the terrible experiments on people that Dr. Mengele conducted in Auschwitz. Thousands of victims were tortured to death without any practical benefit. But in general, experiments on humans were carried out not only by the Germans of Nazi Germany. In the comments, I was asked many times to tell about the Japanese Squad 731. These dudes were operating at the same time as the German death factories, but I didn't want to talk about them so soon after Mengele. The topic is similar. I thought maybe I'd come back to her sometime later. But now it seems that there can be no later. YouTube can be closed at any minute. By the way, subscribe to my Telegram, so as not to get lost. So, since such a heat wave has gone, we will not postpone the story about the next horrors of the war. So, the Second World War claimed millions of human lives. Some stories are better known, such as the final solution of the Jewish question, and some are worse, such as the Japanese attempts to invent a plague bomb when tens of thousands of Chinese residents were killed. The documents were destroyed, the project managers were not even formally punished, and officially Japan recognized the existence of the 731 Squad only in the 90s. Up to this point it was documented as the Department of Prevention and Water Purification of the Guangdong Army. The unremarkable name of an ordinary medical organization. Blocking the internet is gaining momentum and no one is going to stop. So in order to somehow preserve our usual way of life, there is only one way, VPN. It will help you bypass the blockages and continue using your favorite services. It remains for a small matter to choose the VPN that guarantees the security of your data and high connection speed. And here I have something to advise you. Surfshark VPN service. It is easily installed on any system, gives access to servers from 65 countries and works on an unlimited number of devices on a single subscription. And what about security? Won't they be able to figure you out in case of something? The developers took care of this, too. Surfshark uses the most reliable protocols that exclude that your IP or the location of the device will become known to someone. Your anonymity will also be protected legally. The Surfshark network is registered in the British Virgin Islands, where companies are not required to register their users' data. Follow the link in the description, install Surfshark and gain digital freedom. By following the link, you will receive an 83% discount and 3 months as a gift. By the way, if anything, Surfshark will help you to continue watching me on YouTube. So, what was Squad 731 essentially? It could not be called a concentration camp in the usual sense of the word. There were no barracks for several thousand people, there were no gas chambers and forced labor. The employees of the detachment had quite practical scientific goals, to study the possibilities of the human body as best as possible without regard to humanity. Understand how the body reacts to cold, pressure, various diseases, blood loss and projectiles. The detachment was led by a military surgeon, Shiro, and SI, and he was, frankly speaking, a specific person. And this one came from a noble and wealthy Japanese family. He was an excellent student, but his classmates considered him cocky and arrogant. After medical school, he worked briefly in the army, and then was sent to deepen his education in graduate school. There, this one also proved himself to be a capable student who doesn't care about other people at all. For example, he liked to do experiments at night on equipment that was thoroughly washed by other students, but he never cleaned up after himself, which infuriated absolutely everyone, including teachers. And instead of pets, Sayo got himself bacteria in test tubes. An ardent nationalist and fan of the emperor, since 1926, and the SIO began to advocate for the creation of Japan's own biological weapons program. In the 28th year, he traveled to Europe, where he studied the experience of using poisonous gases during the First World War. In Europe, by the way, this practice was considered inhumane and banned the use of gas as a weapon. But a young Japanese doctor, on the contrary, decided that this was an extremely effective method of fighting enemy soldiers and began lobbying for the creation of such weapons in Japan, thanks to which he quickly found high-ranking patrons. The main supporter and Sayo was the Minister of the Army. The doctor quickly grew up the career ladder and in 1936 was appointed head of the newly created Detachment 731. There he came to the rank of major and in a few years of the war he rose to lieutenant general. He also received his titles and awards for the murder of a huge number of prisoners of war and civilians. According to the largest estimates, about 500,000 people were killed. The main complex of buildings of the detachment was not in Japan, but in Manchuria, a part of China that the Japanese captured during the war. This was done on purpose, as it was easier to bring prisoners here. By the way, this was not the first attempt by the Japanese to create a biolab. And this, back in the 32nd year, he headed the so-called Toga Division. It already resembled a future murder factory in many ways. Prisoners were taken there, well fed and all health indicators were measured. And as soon as the doctors came to the conclusion that the patient was completely healthy, he was killed in the most sophisticated way. For example, they slowly let out all the blood and watched when death occurs. Or starved, or even infected with deadly diseases. This shop had to be closed 2 years later when one of the prisoners escaped. He could give out the location of the laboratory and tell what kind of tin was going on there. Therefore, the Japanese closed everything as quickly as possible, burned, shot the remaining ones and moved. And Sayo took into account the mistakes of the past, so the main complex of the 731 detachment was built as a fortress. For all the years of its existence, I could not escape from there. Nobody. The prisoners had no names, everyone was given a 3-digit number at the entrance and locked in a solitary cell in chains. No barracks for 1,000 people, like in Germany. The Japanese have taken the dehumanization of people to a new level. Prisoners were literally not considered human. Among themselves, the staff called them logs. This term originated as a black joke, because according to the documents, the building of the detachment was officially considered a sawmill. By the way, even during the war, Japanese scientists from the detachment quietly published the results of their research in international scientific journals. All the stages of the experiments were described in detail there, but it was said that they were carried out not on humans, but on some Manchurian monkeys. There were several ways to become a guinea pig in the 731 squad. Unlike Germany, where all Jews were simply sent to concentration camps, the Japanese did not have such a clear national policy. Therefore, prisoners were chosen not on a national basis, but on a social status, if I may say so. Ordinary criminals, partisans, political prisoners, homeless people and those arrested by the military police for alleged anti-Japanese activities were sent to the camp. 70% of the prisoners were Chinese, and the rest were random. From Russian prisoners of war to Hindus and even New Zealanders, the gender and age of people were not important at the same time. Women, old people, and children were dragged to the camp. Some women were even forcibly inseminated in order to conduct experiments on pregnant women, and it is clear that Cairo and Syria were far from the only doctor. About 300 scientists from all over Japan participated in the torture, and practically none of them has ever shown any signs of pity. I will go on to describe the experiments themselves a little later, but now I will say that not all of them had any specific goals. Often Japanese doctors did something just to see what would come of it. So to speak, out of professional curiosity. For example, to see how the body behaves if its head is cut off. Or what happens if a person removes the stomach and attaches the esophagus directly to the intestines. No one counted the prisoners. If you kill one, they'll bring you more tomorrow. So there was no need to protect people, at least for pragmatic reasons. And if frivolous experiments were conducted in this way, then what can we say about serious ones? The prisoners were injected with plague, typhus and other diseases. To study venereal diseases, prisoners were forced to have sex to see how these diseases were transmitted. And to see if the disease is transmitted to the child, sick women were forcibly fertilized. By the way, sometimes the guards raped women just like that, without any scientific sense. But that's not all. To understand how the disease behaves inside the human body, you need to look inside the body somehow. And how to do it? Easy, you just need to cut a living person from the chest to the pubis, and without anesthesia. Because anesthesia is a pity, it will be useful at the front. And I don't feel sorry for the prisoners. But it was not limited to diseases alone. Logs had different limbs amputated to study blood loss. They removed parts of the lungs, liver, and even the brain to see what would happen to the body. By the way, it was not only in the 731 squad that they liked to open living people. More than 1,000 military doctors were engaged in this throughout occupied China. But that's not all. Even in the squad, human targets were used to test weapons, for example, grenades and flamethrowers. People were dragged to the landfill, dressed in different clothes and set off explosions at different distances from them. Well, to calculate the optimal distance to kill. In the same way, everything was tested on people, from artillery shells with shrapnel to bayonets and knives. Those who did not die immediately were treated, but not for humane reasons, but only in order to understand which wounds can be cured and which cannot. In general, how, with what and for how much it was possible to kill a person was the main goal of all experiments. And for this purpose, the Japanese came up with the most sophisticated ways of killing. I have already talked about how people were deprived of food, but prisoners were also put in pressure chambers and the air was pumped out. By the way, this was also done in Germany, but the Japanese went even further and literally tore people in their cells. And they also burned prisoners, changed their human blood for horse blood, hung them upside down for several days, put heavy objects on them, electrocuted them, did not let them drink, shoved them into centrifuges and spun them to death. Poisoned with radiation, chemicals and even buried alive. Some such tests were later described by the participants themselves as psychopathic sadistic, without any practical military application. Like trying to establish after what time 3-day-old babies freeze. Sometimes autopsies of people were carried out just for demonstration. Some Japanese general came and said bluntly, they say, "I want to see what the lungs look like inside." The doctors said there was. And they immediately escorted the general to the operating room. The head of the Frostbite Research Department, Hisata Yoshimura, even wrote a scientific article with a video demonstration based on these experiments. However, the deaths of 2 adults, not babies, were captured on film. Nevertheless, the inhumanity of the experiments is simply amazing. By the way, the experiments were carried out not only within the walls of the camp. There was a university in Harbin where many Russians and Ukrainians studied. One day, a delegation of scientists from the camp arrived there directly by steam. They gathered the guys, took them to the gym, stripped them, hung them with sensors and forced them to put their hands in icy water. Half an hour later, when almost all the subjects fainted, the Japanese stopped the experiment, helped everyone to warm their fingers, apologized and left. Yoshimura did not feel any remorse. On the pages of the article, which, by the way, was published after the war, he calmly told that he froze 20 children to death and based on observations compiled an index of resistance to frostbite. Moreover, the observations were so extensive that they even took into account the time of day, the degree of hunger, physical exertion and a bunch of other parameters. And to the accusation of the inhumanity of such experiments, Shimura also said that, on the other hand, they helped save thousands of other lives. In 1978, Yoshimura received a state award from the hands of the emperor. But I don't think that the experimental logs were willing to die in terrible agony in the name of future generations. By the way, why has no one been able to escape from there? But because no one knew where he was. Prisoners were delivered at night in cars without windows. The last section of the road the car was traveling underground. People did not understand at all where they were being taken and where they ended up. They could not see the landscape outside the window, nor the sky, nor anything at all. They were kept in solitary cells without windows. And the doors from the cells led to a complex system of corridors from which there was no exit. There was only one riot there all the time. By the way, it was organized by 2 Russian prisoners. The beginning was like in a movie. One prisoner pretended to be sick, and when a guard entered the cell, he attacked him and took away the keys. He opened all the doors he could find, let dozens of people out. But the maze of corridors proved to be an insurmountable obstacle. As a result, the guards simply shot all the rioters. However, considering what kind of torture they could have been subjected to, it can be said that they were still lucky. The average life expectancy of one prisoner was 2 months. At best, this time stretched to a year. And here's another interesting fact for you. By and large, the Japanese didn't care who they killed for the sake of science. There was a doctor named Yoshio Sudu. He was unlucky enough to get infected with the plague during one of the experiments. Do you think they put him in a special box and began to treat him intensively? As if not so. The doctor of the court began to examine in the same way as other logs, how he gradually loses weight, becomes covered with purple spots, how it becomes more and more difficult for him to breathe every day. Well, in the end, like the others, he was tied to the surgical table and his intestines were released. And apparently the court did not understand until the last what everything was going to. Because according to eyewitnesses, his last word was the cry of the beast. And he shouted at the one who approached him with a scalpel. But the Detachment 731 became famous not only for such experiments. At the beginning of the video, I said that about 500,000 people are considered victims of the detachment. It is clear that such a number of 300 doctors could not have killed with their own hands, even for several years of war. So where did these victims come from? The answer, again, is what I have already said today. The main task of the detachment was to create biological weapons. Fighting at the front with the active army is dangerous and expensive. It is much easier to arrange an epidemic behind enemy lines and capture already deserted cities. But biological weapons, like any other, require testing. Moreover, attempts to use weapons without testing ended in failure. In the 39th year, during the battles of the Japanese against the Red Army in the Kocking Gol area, a group of scientists led by the same Sher and C decided to infect Soviet soldiers with typhus. To do this, they poured several barrels of poisoned water into the river, which flowed towards the Soviet positions. But something went wrong, and no one got sick. So before the new attack, it was decided to try out the new weapons on the locals first. I'm not kidding. There was no special selection of subjects. Planes just started dropping plague fleas right on the cities. The first target was Ninba and Shand in 1940. As a result, several tens of thousands of people died there from the plague. But that wasn't all. In Nanjing, the Japanese infected wells with typhus, from where the locals took water. Within a few days, an epidemic broke out in the city. Researchers enthusiastically wrote that typhus is the most effective disease. In total, the Japanese conducted 12 such tests, which affected 11 Chinese cities. Chinese residents were infected not only with plague and typhus, but also with cholera, smallpox, botulism and anthrax. Sometimes infected parcels were given out as humanitarian aid, and when an epidemic began in the city, Japanese people in protective suits simply entered there and examined the dying. The design of the flea bomb was proposed by the personal head of the Detachment 731 and C. Siru. But again, history knows one case of friendly FAI. One cholera bomb was thrown into the city, next to which the Japanese army was standing. Not only 10,000 Chinese citizens died, but also 1,700 Japanese soldiers. The Chinese government sent a delegation to the affected areas to treat and fix the attack. Chinese scientists wrote a report for all allied countries, but it was almost unnoticed. It was only in the 43rd year that Franklin Roosevelt officially condemned the use of biological weapons by the Japanese. In general, during the tests, according to various estimates, about 400,000 civilians died. But all these were senseless sacrifices, because such plague bombs have never been used for real combat missions. The Japanese had such plans, and Sayo lobbied for the idea of launching a biological attack on California. But at first one of the ministers opposed it, and when the date of the attack was still set, the war ended. The territory on which the main complex of the Detachment 731 was located was occupied by the Red Army in the 45th year. The Japanese had to hurriedly abandon the equipment, and an order came from above to cover up all traces. Documents were destroyed, the remaining 300 prisoners were killed, and even 600 camp workers were shot. The building of the complex was blown up, and each boss and doctor were given capsules with poison, so that if they were captured, they would not give out secret information. But how, with such secrecy, did we finally find out what was going on in the squadron? Thank you to Lieutenant Colonel Sanders. This is not the one that KFC, but a real colonel. He arrived in Japan immediately after the war to investigate the Japanese biological weapons program. Naturally, he didn't know anything about the 731 squad, but there was an argument that worked flawlessly on the Japanese. He threatened the scientists that if they refused to cooperate, they would be extradited to the Soviet Union. The threat took effect, and the very next day Sanders received a handwritten confession, which he personally handed over to General Makarov. This is how Americans first learned what horrors the Japanese were actually engaged in. But remember, I said that practically none of them suffered any punishment? How is this possible? After all, the German concentration camp staff did not get off so easily. Many of them were executed, while others were sentenced to long terms. And the fact was that MacArthur secretly granted immunity to the entire leadership of the camp. Why? So that the details of Japan's military program would not become public and no one would know about them, especially the Soviet Union. After the war, Japan had its own military tribunal, something like the Nuremberg one, but not a single doctor from the detachment appeared before the court there. Only once did the prosecutor say something about experiments with poisons, but this case did not go further. Tsuruo and she quietly lived to old age and even went to the USA with a course of lectures. In Japan, he opened a clinic for the poor, where he treated patients for free. Another doctor became the director of the largest Japanese pharmaceutical company, where I worked until my death. In general, they killed a lot of people and made a good career for themselves. By the way, how justified was the Japanese fear of the USSR? And how true was the calculation of the Americans that the refusal to punish the Detachment 731 would be a lesser evil compared to the fact that the Soviets would receive data on biological weapons? In 1949, the Soviet Union held its own trial of Japanese prisoners. The crimes of the 731 squad were openly discussed there. There were 7 Japanese generals and doctors in the dock. As a result, all of them were sentenced to prison terms ranging from 2 to 25 years. By Soviet standards, these were unusually lenient sentences for war criminals. But what is even stranger is that all of them were released already in the 50s and quietly returned to their homeland. By the way, I heard that after returning to Japan, doctors were offered to write memoirs about the horrors of the camps. Not one agreed. Because they probably haven't been to the camps. And there is every reason to believe that the Japanese were afraid of the USSR in vain. Probably, they also received minimum terms there in exchange for information about biological weapons. The result was a paradoxical situation. Because of the fear of America and the USSR of each other, Japanese sadists escaped punishment. And I want the evil to be punished in the end. Have a nice day.